If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The first rays of sunlight crept through the cracks of the makeshift wooden walls, casting long shadows across the single room that served as both bedroom and living space for Thomas Wilson and his twin daughters. At 42, his weathered face bore the marks of countless sleepless nights and endless worry, yet his eyes retained a glimmer of determination that had carried him through the darkest times. "Sarah, Emma, time to wake up," he called softly, watching his 12-year-old daughters stir beneath their thin blankets. The girls shared a small mattress in the corner of their humble dwelling, while Thomas slept on a worn-out sleeping bag nearby. Sarah, the more pragmatic of the twins, was already sitting up, her long brown hair tangled from sleep. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled, immediately moving to help with their morning routine. Emma, still caught in the remnants of her dreams, took a few moments longer to join the waking world. Their breakfast ritual was a carefully choreographed dance of sacrifice. Thomas divided their meager provisions, 2 pieces of bread and a small portion of peanut butter, making sure the girls received the larger shares. He watched with a mixture of pride and heartache as Sarah secretly slipped part of her portion onto Emma's plate when she thought no one was looking. "You need to eat too, sweetheart," Thomas said, catching Sarah's eye. She just shrugged, a gesture far too mature for her 12 years. "I'm not that hungry anyway, Dad," she replied, though the slight rumble of her stomach betrayed her words. Emma, still maintaining her childlike innocence despite their circumstances, was already chattering about her plans for the day at school. "Ms. Rodriguez said we're going to start a new art project today. Do you think we could get some colored pencils, Dad? They don't have to be new ones." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pain of having to disappoint his children yet again. "We'll see, Princess. Maybe next week after I collect enough recyclables." The mention of his work brought a shadow across Sarah's face. She understood all too well the reality of their situation. Every morning, Thomas would head to the local landfill, spending hours sorting through mountains of waste, searching for anything that could be recycled or sold. The pay was minimal, barely enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. As the girls prepared for school, Thomas gathered his tools, heavy-duty gloves, a large cart, and several empty bags. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of another scorching day ahead. He helped the girls with their worn backpacks, making sure they had their homework and the simple lunches he'd prepared. More bread, this time with a small apple each that he'd managed to buy on sale. "Remember, straight to school and straight back home," he reminded them, as he did every morning. "I'll try to be back before dark." "We know, Dad," the twins chorused in unison, sharing a look that spoke volumes about their understanding of their father's concerns. Before leaving, Emma threw her arms around Thomas's waist, squeezing tight. "Love you, Dad." Sarah joined the hug, more reserved but no less affectionate. These moments were what kept Thomas going, what made every back-breaking day at the landfill worthwhile. As they parted ways at the corner of their street, the girls heading toward their school and Thomas toward the landfill, he couldn't help but look back at his daughters. Their matching backpacks were faded and patched in several places. Their clothes were hand-me-downs from the local church's donation bin, but they walked with their heads held high, supporting each other as they always had. The walk to the landfill gave Thomas time to think, to worry, to plan. The bills were piling up, and the rent was due soon. The recycling company had been paying less lately, citing market conditions he didn't fully understand. He needed a miracle, but miracles seemed in short supply in their part of town. Little did Thomas know that this ordinary morning would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events. Events that would test his resolve, challenge his principles, and ultimately change the course of their lives forever. As he approached the towering gates of the landfill, the sun now fully risen in the sky, he had no way of knowing that today would be different from all the others that had come before. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Thomas's back as he methodically sorted through the day's new arrivals at the landfill. His experienced eyes quickly identified valuable materials, aluminum cans here, copper wire there, salvageable electronics that could fetch a decent price at the recycling center. Each find, no matter how small, represented another meal, another bill payment, another day of keeping his family afloat. His thoughts drifted to the twins' upcoming birthday. They never asked for much, knowing their circumstances, but he desperately wanted to give them something special this year. Sarah had been eyeing a used scientific calculator at the thrift store, while Emma had mentioned wanting new art supplies. Simple dreams for 12-year-olds, yet they might as well have been asking for the moon. The rumble of an approaching vehicle caught his attention. Through the heat waves rising from the ground, Thomas spotted something unusual, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz winding its way through the maze of garbage heaps. The car looked completely out of place in these surroundings, its polished surface reflecting the harsh sunlight like a mirror. The vehicle came to a stop about 50 yards from where Thomas stood. He instinctively stepped behind a pile of discarded furniture, something about the scene setting off warning bells in his mind. The driver's door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, his shoes completely unsuitable for the terrain. Thomas recognized him immediately. Richard Sterling, the real estate tycoon whose face frequently appeared in local newspapers. Sterling moved to the trunk, opened it, and removed a cardboard box. The box appeared new, clean, another anomaly, in this place of discarded and broken things. With quick, nervous movements, Sterling placed the box near a heap of construction debris, then hurried back to his car. The entire scene lasted less than a minute before the Mercedes disappeared in a cloud of dust. Thomas waited several minutes after the car left, his curiosity warring with caution. Finally, he approached the box, noting its high quality and pristine condition. It seemed too valuable to discard, and his recycler's instinct told him it could be worth something. As he bent to lift it, a sound froze him in place. A sound that had no business coming from a cardboard box in a landfill. A sound he hadn't heard in years, not since the twins were infants. A baby's whimper. His hands trembled as he carefully opened the box's flaps. Nestled inside, wrapped in what appeared to be expensive silk blankets, was a newborn baby, no more than a few days old. The infant's face was scrunched up, ready to cry, but upon seeing Thomas it merely blinked up at him with startlingly blue eyes. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, his mind racing. The baby was clean, well cared for, dressed in what looked like designer clothes. This wasn't an act of desperation by someone who couldn't afford to care for their child. This was something else entirely. He quickly checked the baby for any signs of distress, remembering his experiences with the twins. The infant appeared healthy, though growing uncomfortable in the heat. Thomas found a bottle of formula and some diapers tucked into the side of the box, along with a small envelope. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of expensive stationery containing just 2 lines of text. "His name is James, take care of him." Thomas stood in the sweltering heat, holding the baby close to his chest, his mind whirling with questions and implications. He thought of his own struggles to provide for his daughters, of the mounting bills and empty cupboards at home. Taking care of another child seemed impossible, but as he looked down at the innocent face, memories of another time flooded back, of when he'd first held Sarah and Emma, of the promise he'd made to always protect those who needed him. The baby gripped his finger with surprising strength, and in that moment Thomas knew he couldn't simply walk away. The sound of approaching vehicles snapped him back to reality. He needed to make a decision quickly. With careful movements, he gathered the box and its contents, his collection cart momentarily forgotten. As he made his way toward the landfill exit, the baby stayed remarkably quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Thomas had no way of knowing that his decision in this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel secrets, challenge powerful people, and ultimately change not just his life but the lives of everyone he held dear. For now he focused on one simple truth: a helpless child needed him, and despite everything he would find a way to help. The walk home felt longer than usual as Thomas carefully carried the box containing baby James. The infant had fallen, asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully, completely unaware of the turmoil in his temporary guardian's mind. The afternoon sun was beginning to descend, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood. Thomas checked his watch. The twins would be home from school soon. He quickened his pace, knowing he needed their help to figure out what to do. Next, despite their young age, Sarah and Emma often displayed wisdom beyond their years, particularly in difficult situations. As he approached their modest home, he could already see the girls sitting on the front steps, homework spread across their laps. They looked up at his unusually early return, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity as they noticed the box in his arms. "Dad?" Sarah stood first, her analytical mind already working to understand the situation. "What's that?" Emma bounced up beside her sister, her natural enthusiasm bubbling over. "Did you find something good at the landfill today?" Thomas hushed them gently, motioning for them to follow him inside. Once in their small living space, he carefully set the box down and revealed its precious contents. The twins' reactions were immediate and drastically different. Sarah's face paled, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "Dad, is that a baby? Where did it come from?" Emma, on the other hand, immediately moved closer, her eyes wide with wonder. "He's so tiny. Can I hold him, please?" Thomas sat heavily on their worn couch, explaining everything he had witnessed at the landfill. He showed them the note, the expensive clothes, and described the mysterious man in the Mercedes. As he spoke, baby James began to stir, his tiny fingers flexing as he opened his startlingly blue eyes. "We have to help him," Emma declared without hesitation, already reaching for the bottle of formula found in the box. "He needs us, Dad." Sarah, however, remained practical. "Dad, we can barely afford to feed ourselves. And what about the authorities? We should call the police or child services." Thomas ran his hands through his grey-streaked hair, knowing his eldest daughter by 7 minutes had valid points. Their own situation was precarious at best. Yet something about the way James had been abandoned, the calculated nature of it, made him hesitate to involve officials immediately. "Let's think this through," he said, watching as Emma successfully prepared the bottle and began feeding James with natural ease. "Something doesn't add up about this situation. That man, Sterling, he's one of the wealthiest people in the city. Why would someone like that abandon a baby in a landfill?" Sarah paced the small room, her mind working through the problem. Maybe he's not the father? Or maybe there's something else going on that we don't know about. Whatever the reason, Emma interjected, still cradling James, "We can't just hand him over without knowing he'll be safe. Look how peaceful he is. He trusts us already." Thomas watched his daughters with pride and concern. Emma's compassionate heart and Sarah's sharp mind were both valuable in this situation, but they were pulling in opposite directions. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. "We'll keep him tonight," Thomas finally decided, "just until we can figure out more about what's going on. Tomorrow, I'll start making some inquiries, try to understand this situation better." The practical concerns began mounting immediately. They had no crib, no diapers beyond the few provided, and no proper supplies for an infant. Their small home, barely adequate for 3 people, would need to accommodate a 4th. But as the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. Sarah, despite her initial reservations, began researching infant care on her school tablet, making detailed lists of what they would need. Emma transformed their small storage box into a makeshift bassinet, lining it with their softest blankets. Together, they created a schedule for feeding and care, dividing responsibilities among themselves. Thomas would handle the night feedings, since he was used to little sleep, while the girls would take turns watching James during homework time. As night fell, they sat together on their old couch, the baby sleeping peacefully in his improvised bed. The gravity of their situation hung in the air, along with questions they couldn't yet answer. How long could they really keep this up? What would happen when their already stretched resources ran out? And perhaps most importantly, what secrets lay behind James's mysterious arrival in their lives? "Dad," Sarah spoke softly in the dimness, "what if this is bigger than we think? What if we're getting involved in something dangerous?" Thomas looked at his daughter, seeing the worry in her eyes. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy or safe, sweetheart, but we'll face whatever comes together as a family. Emma, half asleep against his shoulder, mumbled, "We're all he has right now." As Thomas tucked his daughters into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change dramatically. The mysterious envelope with its cryptic message seemed to burn in his pocket, and the image of Sterling's expensive car at the landfill kept replaying in his mind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, they had given a helpless infant a safe place to sleep. Whatever consequences lay ahead, Thomas knew in his heart that they had made the right choice. As he settled into his sleeping bag, the soft sounds of James's breathing joining the familiar nighttime noises of their home, he whispered a quiet prayer for guidance in the days to come. The next morning brought new challenges as the temporary family of 4 adjusted to their expanded household. Thomas had managed only a few hours of broken sleep between James's feedings, but he was used to functioning on minimal rest. What he wasn't prepared for was the strange turn of events that awaited him. James had developed a slight fever overnight, his tiny forehead warm to the touch. The discovery sent waves of panic through the household. They had no thermometer, no infant medicine, and certainly no money for a doctor's visit. But as James's temperature continued to rise and his crying became more distressed, Thomas knew they had no choice. "Sarah, Emma, get ready for school," he instructed, already wrapping James in the silk blankets he'd arrived with. "I'm taking him to the emergency room." "But Dad, we want to help," Emma protested, already dressed and hovering anxiously near the baby. Sarah, practical as always, added, "We can't afford a hospital visit. Maybe we should call child services." "Now?" Thomas shook his head firmly. "Something tells me we need to understand more before involving authorities. I'll figure something out with the hospital. You two focus on school. I'll update you later." The girls reluctantly left for school, casting worried glances over their shoulders. Thomas gathered James and the few documents they had, just the mysterious note and the blankets he'd arrived with, and headed to St. Mary's Hospital, the nearest medical facility. In the emergency room, Thomas approached the registration desk with trepidation, explaining that he'd found the baby and needed help. To his absolute shock, the receptionist's face lit up with recognition as soon as she entered James's name into the system. "Ah, yes, Mr. Wilson. We have James's records right here," she said cheerfully, pulling up information on her screen. "Full insurance coverage through Premier Health, all paperwork in order. Dr. Anderson will see him right away." Thomas stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Insurance coverage? Paperwork in order? How was this possible? Before he could question further, a nurse led them to an examination room. Dr. Anderson, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, arrived moments later. She examined James thoroughly, speaking to Thomas as if he were undoubtedly the baby's father. "Just a minor ear infection, Mr. Wilson. Nothing to worry about. Common in newborns. I'll prescribe some drops, and he should feel better within 24 hours. Would you like me to send the prescription to your usual pharmacy?" Thomas managed to nod, still stunned by the surreal situation. The doctor continued reviewing James's medical history on her tablet, mentioning previous checkups and vaccinations that Thomas knew couldn't possibly have happened. After they left the hospital, prescription in hand, Thomas's mind raced with questions. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create a complete medical history for James, listing Thomas as his father. The level of detail and preparation suggested this was no random abandonment. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. At the pharmacy, Thomas received another shock. Not only was the prescription covered by insurance, but there was a note in the system to provide a monthly supply of formula and diapers, all fully paid for. The pharmacist handed over a generous supply of baby necessities, treating Thomas like a regular customer. Walking home with his arms full of unexpected supplies, Thomas felt a growing unease. Whoever had arranged this had significant resources and influence. They hadn't just abandoned James, they'd created an entire paper trail, making it appear as though he had always been Thomas's son. He stopped at a small park to rest and think. James had fallen asleep in his carrier, the medicine already helping with his fever. Thomas pulled out his phone, a basic model he kept for emergencies, and searched for information about Richard Sterling. The results painted a picture of a powerful man with connections throughout the city. Sterling's real estate empire was worth billions, and he was recently married to... Thomas nearly dropped his phone. The woman in the society page photo, standing beside Sterling at their wedding last year, was hauntingly familiar. Elizabeth Sterling, formerly Elizabeth Wilson, his ex-wife. The woman who had walked out on him and the twins a year ago, leaving only a note saying she needed more from life. The pieces began falling into place, creating a picture that made Thomas's blood run cold. The timing, the expensive blankets, the comprehensive paperwork, it all pointed to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As he sat there, watching James sleep peacefully, oblivious to the complicated web surrounding his existence, Thomas realized they had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple case of abandonment. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, is James okay? Please tell us what's happening." Looking at the message, Thomas knew he needed to protect not just James now, but his daughters as well. Whatever game Elizabeth and Sterling were playing, they had dragged his family into it. He stood up, gathering their supplies and the sleeping baby, his jaw set with determination. If they thought he would simply play along with their scheme without question, they had severely underestimated Thomas Wilson. Sarah couldn't focus on her algebra homework. Her mind kept wandering to the mysterious circumstances surrounding baby. James and her father's cryptic text messages about the hospital visit. Something wasn't adding up, and if there was one thing Sarah Wilson couldn't stand, it was an unsolved puzzle. "Emma," she whispered to her twin, who was sketching in her notebook instead of doing her own homework. "I think we need to do some investigating." Emma looked up, her eyes brightening with interest. "About James, did you find something?" Sarah pulled out her tablet, careful to keep it hidden from their teacher's view. During their lunch break, she had done some research on Richard Sterling, the man their father had described from the landfill. The results were interesting enough, but what really caught her attention was a society page photo from 6 months ago. "Look at this," she whispered, sliding the tablet toward her sister. "That's Mr. Sterling at some charity gala, and look who's with him." Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the elegant woman in the designer dress. "Mom?" she breathed, her pencil falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. "But how?" Their mother, Elizabeth, had walked out on them a year ago, leaving nothing but a brief note about needing more from life. The twins had processed the abandonment differently. Sarah with anger and determination to never need anyone again. Emma by throwing herself into her art and trying to keep everyone's spirits up. They got married 3 months after she left. "Us?" Sarah continued, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "And look at this photo from 2 months ago." She swiped to another image, showing Elizabeth Sterling at another social event, wearing a loose-fitting gown that seemed designed to hide her midsection. Emma's artistic eye caught the detail immediately. "She looks like she might have been pregnant," Sarah finished. The timing would match with James's age. The final bell rang, startling both girls. They gathered their things quickly, minds racing with this new information. Instead of heading straight home as they usually did, Sarah led Emma to the public library 2 blocks away. "Dad won't be home for hours," Sarah reasoned. "He texted that he had to go back to the landfill after taking James to the neighbors." "We have time to do some real research." The library's computers were old but functional. Sarah logged into one while Emma kept watch, making sure no one was paying too much attention to their activities. Years of living on the edge of poverty had taught them both to be cautious and resourceful. "Look at this," Sarah murmured, pulling up public records. "Sterling Properties just bought the entire block where the recycling center is located. They're planning to build luxury condominiums there." Emma leaned closer. "But that's where Dad works. If they close the recycling center, we'll lose our only income," Sarah concluded grimly. "And think about it. The timing of James being left at that specific landfill when Dad was working there. It wasn't random at all," Emma realized. her usual cheerfulness replaced by understanding. They wanted Dad to find him. Sarah nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she dug deeper. Sterling has connections everywhere, hospitals, government offices, businesses. He could easily create false documents, set up insurance. But why? Emma asked, pulling out her sketchbook and beginning to draw a timeline of events. It was her way of organizing information, turning facts into visual connections. Why go through all this trouble instead of just... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah knew what she meant. Why not just ask for help? Why orchestrate such an elaborate scheme? I think, Sarah said slowly, we need to visit Mom's new home. Emma looked up sharply. What? But we don't even know where she lives. Sarah turned the computer screen to show a recent real estate listing. Actually, we do. Sterling Mansion is only 3 bus rides away, and look, they're hosting a charity garden party this weekend. The gates will be open to all donors. Sarah, Emma warned, recognizing the determined glint in her twin's eye. This is crazy. We can't just crash a fancy party. We won't crash it, Sarah corrected, pulling up another page. We'll volunteer. Look, they're asking for student volunteers to help serve refreshments. The perfect cover. Emma bit her lip, torn between anxiety and curiosity. Dad would never approve. Dad's trying to protect us, Sarah acknowledged, but we need to protect him too. Something bigger is going on here, Emma. Mom and Sterling aren't just trying to get rid of a baby. They're playing some kind of game with our whole family. The sisters stared at each other, having one of those silent conversations that only twins can manage. Finally, Emma nodded. Okay, but we do this carefully, no risks. Sarah agreed, already filling out the volunteer application forms. As she typed, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something much bigger than they'd imagined. Their mother had always been ambitious, always wanted more than their modest life could offer. But what game was she playing now, and why had she dragged an innocent baby into it? The library was closing when they finally left, their heads full of plans and possibilities. They walked home quickly, knowing their father would worry if they were too late. Neither girl spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover at Sterling Mansion. What they didn't notice was the black Mercedes that pulled away from the curb as they passed, its tinted windows hiding the occupant who watched their departure with great interest. Sterling Mansion loomed. Before them, its manicured gardens and marble fountains a world away from their modest neighborhood. Sarah and Emma, dressed in the volunteer uniforms provided by the charity organization, tried to look as though they belonged among the dozen other students preparing to serve refreshments at the garden party. Remember, Sarah whispered to her, sister, act natural, we're just helpful students earning community service credits for school. Emma nodded, adjusting her name tag that read Emily. Sarah had insisted they use fake names on their applications. Her own tag read Sophie. They'd told their father they were helping with a school fundraiser, hating the deception but knowing he would never approve of their real plan. The event coordinator, a harried woman with a clipboard, gathered the volunteers for instructions. Remember, keep the trays full, smile at the guests, and don't interrupt any conversations. The Sterlings are announcing a major new charitable foundation today, so there will be lots of important people present. The twins exchanged glances. A charitable foundation. The timing seemed significant, though they weren't sure how it connected to their investigation. As the party began, guests in expensive clothes filtered into the gardens. Emma took a position near the refreshment tables, while Sarah circulated with a tray of appetizers, keeping her eyes open for any sign of their mother or Sterling himself. She didn't have to wait long. A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd as Richard Sterling appeared on the mansion's terrace, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. Beside him stood Elizabeth Sterling, looking even more elegant than in the photos, wearing a designer dress that Sarah recognized from her research as costing more than their entire year's rent. "Welcome, everyone," Sterling's voice boomed across the garden. "Elizabeth and I are thrilled to announce the creation of the Sterling Family Foundation, dedicated to helping underprivileged children in our city." Sarah nearly dropped her tray at the irony, but kept her composure. Elizabeth was scanning the crowd as her husband spoke, her practiced smile never wavering. Did she have any idea her own daughters were among the servers? Emma, meanwhile, had managed to position herself near a group of women who seemed to be close to Elizabeth. As she offered them champagne, she kept her ears open, years of being the quiet twin making her nearly invisible to the chattering socialites. Poor Elizabeth, one woman whispered behind her hand. Such a difficult time she's had. Well, what did she expect? Another replied. You can't hide everything forever, at least Richard handled it discreetly. Emma's heart pounded, but she maintained her placid expression, moving slightly closer while pretending to arrange glasses. Still, the first woman continued, starting a children's charity right after. Well, it's a clever move. Richard always knows how to spin things. Sarah had worked her way to the terrace where Elizabeth was now speaking with a reporter. The Sterling Family Foundation represents our commitment to family values, she was saying, her voice carrying the same musical quality the twins remembered from their childhood. Every child deserves a chance at a better life. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. How could their mother speak about family values after abandoning her own children, after what she'd done to James? A sudden commotion near the mansion's entrance drew everyone's attention. Thomas Wilson stood there, holding baby James, with a police officer beside him. Sarah's heart stopped. How had he discovered their plan so quickly? But no, he wasn't looking for them. His eyes were fixed on Elizabeth, whose perfect composure had finally cracked. The champagne glass she held slipped from her fingers, shattering on the terrace stones. I think, Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent garden, we need to have a conversation about family values, Elizabeth. Sterling moved quickly to his wife's side, his face darkening with anger. This is a private event. Security! Actually, the police officer spoke up, we have some questions about certain documents filed with the county clerk's office, specifically about a birth certificate registered last week. Emma had made her way to Sarah's side. Both girls pressing back against the mansion's wall, forgotten by the adults in the unfolding drama. They watched as their mother's carefully constructed world began to crack, her perfect mask slipping to reveal something desperate underneath. Richard, she whispered. But Sterling was already moving away from her, speaking urgently into his phone, leaving her to face Thomas and the officer alone. James chose that moment to cry, a sharp wail that cut through the tense atmosphere. Elizabeth flinched at the sound, her eyes finally finding her daughters in their volunteer uniforms. The recognition that flashed across her face was followed by something else. Was it shame? Fear? The garden party guests were being quickly ushered out by security, but the twins stayed where they were, watching the people who had shaped their fate, standing in a tableau of confrontation. Their mother, the socialite who had abandoned them for a better life, their father who had never stopped fighting for them, and between them, a baby whose existence threatened to expose secrets that could shatter the elaborate facade of Sterling Mansion forever. The Sterling Mansion's elegant study felt suffocating, despite its high ceilings and expensive furnishings. Thomas sat rigidly in a leather armchair, still holding James close to his chest, while Elizabeth perched on the edge of an antique sofa. Officer Martinez stood by the door, her presence ensuring the conversation would remain civil. How did you figure it out? Elizabeth finally broke the tense silence, her perfectly manicured fingers twisting in her lap. The hospital records, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. No one but you would have known about my mother's maiden name, Anderson. You used it as James's middle name on the birth certificate. Sarah and Emma, who had refused to leave despite the security guard's attempts to escort them out, sat together on a window seat. Their presence seemed to unnerve Elizabeth more than anything else. The girls have grown so much, she said softly, attempting to change the subject. Don't, Sarah's voice cut through the room like ice. Don't pretend you care now. Emma placed a comforting hand on her sister's arm, but her own eyes were hard as she stared at their mother. The woman before them bore little resemblance to the mom who had once braided their hair and sung them to sleep. This Elizabeth was a stranger in expensive clothes and perfect makeup. "Mrs. Sterling," Officer Martinez spoke up, "perhaps you'd like to explain why you registered Mr. Wilson as the father of your child without his knowledge or consent. That's a serious legal offense." Elizabeth's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand. Richard, he has certain expectations for his public image. When I discovered I was pregnant, it wasn't part of his plan. He said it would ruin everything we'd built. So you decided to abandon your baby in a landfill." Thomas's voice rose slightly, causing James to stir in his arms. He immediately softened his tone, gently soothing the infant. "No, I mean, yes, but..." Elizabeth stood up, pacing the room. "Richard arranged everything. The paperwork, the insurance, the monthly supplies. James would be taken care of, and you're such a good father, Thomas. I knew you would." "You knew I would clean up your mess," Thomas finished. "Just like I did when you left us. Did you even think about what this would do to the girls, to James?" A knock at the study door interrupted them. Richard Sterling entered, followed by a man in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase. "This conversation is over," Sterling announced. "My attorney will handle things from here. Officer, you can leave." "Actually, sir," Martinez replied, "I can't. We have evidence of multiple crimes here. Document fraud, child abandonment, conspiracy. Evidence?" Sterling laughed, but there was an edge to it. "It's their word against ours. And who do you think the courts will believe? A wealthy philanthropist or a garbage picker?" The cruel words hung in the air, but Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Actually, I have something you might want to hear." He pressed play, and Elizabeth's voice filled the room. "Richard arranged everything, the paperwork, the insurance." The recording continued, capturing every damning word she'd spoken minutes earlier. Sterling's face darkened with rage. "You recorded this illegally. It won't be admissible." "Oklahoma is a one-party consent state," Sarah spoke up, her voice clear and confident. "We researched it at the library. Dad only needed his own permission to record the conversation." Emma added quietly, "We also have copies of all the falsified documents. We found them in the county records. Public access is wonderful, isn't it?" Sterling turned on Elizabeth. "You let yourself be recorded. Do you have any idea what this could do to us, to my reputation?" Elizabeth flinched away from his anger, and in that moment, she seemed to age years. The perfect facade crumbled, revealing the scared woman beneath. I couldn't live with it anymore, Richard. Abandoning another child." "Another child?" Thomas's question cut through the rising tension. "What do you mean, another child?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth's eyes darted to Sterling, who had gone very still. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps," Officer Martinez suggested, "Mrs. Sterling would like to make a full statement down at the station, where she can be assured of privacy and protection." Elizabeth looked at her husband, then at her daughters, and finally at James, sleeping peacefully in Thomas's arms. Years of secrets and lies seemed to weigh on her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes," she said, "I think it's time I told the truth, about everything, about what really happened 3 years ago with Richard's first wife, about why I really left my family, and about who James's father really is." Sterling moved to stop her, but Officer Martinez was faster, stepping between them. "Mr. Sterling, I suggest you and your attorney stay right here. We'll have some questions, for you as well." As Elizabeth was led from the study, she paused beside Thomas. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting him, but I was really just protecting myself, just like before." The twins watched their mother leave, their minds spinning with questions. What had happened 3 years ago? What secrets had she been keeping? And most importantly, what truth about James's parentage was she about to reveal? Thomas held James closer, knowing that the answers would change all their lives forever. But looking at his daughters, seeing their strength and unity in the face of chaos, he knew they would face whatever came next together as a family. The police stations. Interview room was a stark contrast to Sterling Mansion's opulent study. Elizabeth sat alone at the metal table, her designer dress out of place against the institutional grey walls. Through the observation window, Thomas watched as she began to tell her story to Detective Chen. It started 3 years ago, Elizabeth's voice came through the speakers clearly. I was working as an interior decorator for Richard's first wife, Margaret. She discovered something in Richard's private files, something about his business dealings that could have ruined him. Thomas felt Sarah and Emma press closer to him on either side. They had refused to stay home, insisting they had a right to know the truth. James was being cared for by a social worker in the next room, though Thomas could still feel the phantom weight of the baby in his arms. Margaret threatened to expose everything, Elizabeth continued. Richard was different then, desperate, angry. He said he would take care of it, but I never imagined he would. Would what? Mrs. Sterling, Detective Chen prompted gently. Margaret had a heart condition. Richard, he made sure she couldn't access her medication during a business trip. When it happened, everyone assumed it was natural causes. But I knew. And Richard knew I knew. Thomas felt sick. The implications of what Elizabeth was saying were horrifying. Beside him, Sarah had gone very still, while Emma pressed her face into his shoulder. He started paying me more attention after that, Elizabeth went on. Expensive gifts, promotions at work. When he proposed, I told myself I deserved it, that I was moving up in the world. I tried to forget about my family, about the life I'd left behind. But then I got pregnant. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Richard was furious. He said he couldn't risk another scandal, another person who could potentially threaten his empire. He wanted me to end the pregnancy, but I couldn't. Not after what happened with Margaret. So we made a deal. What kind of deal? The detective's voice was neutral, professional. He would let me have the baby, but no one could know it was his. He created all the documentation making Thomas the father, arranged the whole elaborate scheme at the landfill. He said it was perfect. The baby would be safe with Thomas and his reputation would be protected. In the observation room, Thomas's mind was reeling. James was Richard Sterling's son. The man had orchestrated this entire situation not out of malice toward Thomas's family, but to hide his own secrets. But that's not all, is it, Mrs. Sterling? Detective Chen pressed. There's more you haven't told us. Elizabeth's composed facade finally crumbled completely. Richard, he's planning something bigger. The recycling center, the landfill. He's been buying up all the property in that area. But it's not for luxury condos like he claims. He's been using the properties to hide evidence of his illegal dumping operations. Toxic waste, industrial chemicals. Margaret found the proof, and now it's all buried under those sites. Sarah gasped softly. Dad, the headaches you've been getting lately when working at the landfill, the whole community could be at risk, Emma whispered. All those families. Elizabeth was still talking, years of pent-up guilt pouring out. He's been bribing officials, falsifying environmental reports. The new charitable foundation was just another cover, a way to look like he cares about the community while he slowly poisons it. I couldn't let it continue, not when I realized my baby, my other children, would be growing up in the middle of it. Thomas thought about all the families in their neighborhood, all the children playing in parks near the contaminated sites. His anger at Elizabeth's abandonment was gradually being replaced by understanding. She had made terrible choices, but in the end she had found the courage to speak up. Richard will never let this get out, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. He'll deny everything, use his money and influence to bury the truth just like he buried everything else. Detective Chen slid a document across the table. That's why we need you to make an official statement. Your testimony, combined with the evidence we've gathered from Margaret's old files and the environmental surveys, could finally bring him to justice. Outside the interview room, Officer Martinez appeared with a stack of papers. Mr. Wilson, there's something else you need to see. We found these in Sterling's home office, documents about the recycling center. He wasn't just planning to close it. He was going to frame you for the illegal dumping, make it look like you had been accepting payoffs to allow toxic disposal at the site. Thomas felt the weight of this revelation settle over him. Sterling had planned to destroy not just his livelihood, but his reputation and freedom as well. And he would have succeeded if Elizabeth hadn't chosen this moment to speak up. Through the window, they watched as Elizabeth signed the official statement. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of her society wife persona. But there was a new strength in her posture, the strength of someone who had finally chosen truth over pretense. "Dad?" Emma's voice was quiet. "What happens now? To all of us?" Thomas looked at his daughters, thinking of James in the next room, of their community that needed protection, of the long road ahead as this case wound its way through the justice system. "Now," he said, "we do what we've always done. We face it together one day at a time, and we make sure the truth comes to light no matter what it costs." Sarah squared her shoulders, looking so much like her mother's younger self that it made Thomas's heart ache. "Together," she agreed. "All of us." They turned back to the window as Elizabeth stood, years of secrets finally unburdened from her shoulders. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years they were all walking it in the same direction, toward truth, toward justice, and toward healing. The following days brought a whirlwind of changes to the Wilson family. Their modest home became a hub of activity, as environmental investigators, lawyers, and journalists came and went. Thomas had taken temporary leave from the recycling center, which was now under investigation as part of the growing case against Sterling Industries. Sarah sat at their small kitchen table, helping Emma organize the mounting paperwork that had become part of their daily lives. The twins had thrown themselves into supporting their father, each in their own way. Sarah used her analytical skills to help the investigators make sense of the complex paper trail, while Emma's artistic abilities proved unexpectedly valuable in creating visual timelines and diagrams of Sterling's illegal operations. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a document. "Sterling's company has been buying properties in poor neighborhoods for years, always using different shell companies. The pattern is so obvious once you see it." Emma nodded, adding another red line to her intricate map of property purchases and toxic dump sites. And each time they started with a recycling center or waste management facility, places people wouldn't look too closely at. Their father entered the kitchen carrying James, who had just woken from his nap. The baby had become a permanent part of their household now, with emergency custody granted to Thomas while the legal proceedings continued. Despite the chaos around them, James remained a source of joy, his innocent smiles providing much-needed light in difficult moments. "The social worker called," Thomas announced, settling into a chair while James played with his shirt buttons. "Elizabeth's testimony is holding up. The district attorney thinks they have enough evidence to bring charges against Sterling." The twins exchanged glances. They had complicated feelings about their mother now. Her actions had hurt them deeply, but her courage in coming forward had potentially saved countless lives. "Have you heard from Mum?" Emma asked quietly, adding a gentle blue curve to her diagram. Thomas nodded. "She's staying with her sister in Oklahoma City. The prosecutor has her under protection until the trial." He paused, studying his daughters' faces. "She asked about seeing you both when you're ready." Sarah's pencil stopped moving. "I'm not sure I'll ever be ready." "Me neither," Emma admitted, though her voice held less anger than her sister's. "But maybe someday." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Officer Martinez entered, followed by a man in a suit who introduced himself as Mr. Patterson from the Environmental Protection Agency. "Mr. Wilson," Patterson began, setting his briefcase on the table, "we've completed our initial assessment of the contamination levels around the recycling center and landfill sites. The results are concerning." Thomas instinctively held James closer as Patterson laid out maps and reports. The contamination had spread further than anyone initially suspected, seeping into groundwater and soil across several neighborhoods. "The good news," Martinez added, "is that this evidence makes our case against Sterling even stronger. The bad, News is that the cleanup will take years and cost millions. What about the families living there? Thomas asked, thinking of his neighbors, the children who played in those contaminated areas. That's actually why we're here, Patterson said, pulling out another document. The EPA is preparing to declare these areas a priority cleanup site. All affected residents will need to be temporarily relocated during the decontamination process. The implications hit the family hard. They would have to leave their home, the only place the twins had ever known. But before despair could set in, Martinez spoke again. There's something else you should know. The Whistleblower Protection Program includes compensation for key witnesses, Elizabeth's testimony, combined, with your evidence about the landfill operations, qualifies your family for substantial support. She handed Thomas an envelope. Inside was a check with more zeros than he had ever seen, along with documents for a rental house in a safe neighborhood across town. It's temporary, Martinez explained, just until the cleanup is complete, but it's fully furnished and has enough room for everyone, including James. Emma's eyes lit up. Does it have a yard? Could I have a real art space? 3 bedrooms, a study that could be converted to an art studio, and a fenced backyard. Martinez smiled. The program wants to ensure witnesses are comfortable and secure during proceedings. Sarah, ever practical, was already examining the paperwork. What's the catch? No catch, Patterson assured them, but we would like your continued cooperation. Your father's knowledge of the recycling operations, combined with your mother's testimony and your own research, makes your family crucial to building this case. Thomas looked around their small kitchen, remembering all the meals shared there, all the moments of both hardship and joy. Change was never easy, but sometimes it was necessary. When would we need to move? He asked, watching James reach for one of Emma's colorful markers. As soon as you're ready, Martinez replied. The house is available immediately. We can have agents help with the moving process. The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. Finally, Emma spoke for both of them. We'd like to see it first, make sure it feels right. Thomas smiled, recognizing the resilience that had carried them through so much already. They would face this change as they had faced everything else, together. There's one more thing, Patterson added, reaching into his briefcase. We found these in Sterling's private safe. They're letters from Margaret, his first wife, written just before her passing. She had documented everything, including details about environmental violations we didn't even know about. She sent copies to multiple people for safekeeping, but Sterling managed to intercept them all except one. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. The address on the front was familiar. It was their old home from before Elizabeth left. The recipient's name made Thomas's heart stop. Elizabeth Wilson. Margaret knew, Sarah whispered. She tried to warn Mom, even back. Then, the weight of this revelation settled over the kitchen. The truth had been trying to come out for years, waiting for someone brave enough to finally speak up. Now that it had, there would be no going back to the way things were before. But looking at his children's faces, at baby James contentedly, drawing with Emma's markers, Thomas knew that moving forward was exactly what they needed to do. The new house felt like stepping into another world. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating spaces that seemed vast compared to their old home. Emma stood in what would become her art studio, already planning where to set up her easel and supplies. Sarah explored the study, running, her fingers along the built-in bookshelves that would soon hold their small but growing collection of books. Thomas watched his daughters from the doorway, James balanced on his hip. The baby seemed to sense the excitement in the air, his tiny hands reaching out to touch everything within reach. After spending the morning with Martinez and Patterson reviewing more evidence, this moment of peace felt especially precious. Dad. Emma called from the studio. Come look at this. She was standing by the window pointing to a small garden plot in the backyard. We could grow vegetables, maybe even some flowers. Real ones, not just the weeds that grew through the concrete. At the old place. Sarah joined them, her practical nature already asserting itself. We should start with easy plants first. Tomatoes, maybe herbs. I read that gardening can be therapeutic. The sound of a car pulling up outside drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Elizabeth stepping out of a modest sedan, looking very different from her Sterling mansion days. She wore simple clothes now, her hair pulled back naturally, reminding Thomas of the woman he'd first fallen in love with years ago. The twins tensed slightly but didn't retreat. This visit had been arranged through their counselor, part of the healing process everyone agreed they needed to undergo. Elizabeth entered tentatively, carrying a cardboard box. "I brought some things," she said softly. From when you were little." Emma moved first, her naturally compassionate heart winning over caution. She approached her mother, peering into the box. Inside were photo albums, hand-drawn, pictures, small treasures from their early childhood. "Is that my first sketchbook?" she asked, pulling out a worn notebook filled with crayon drawings. Elizabeth nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "You used to draw for hours even when you could barely hold the crayons. And Sarah," she turned to her other daughter, who remained by the window, "this was your favorite." She carefully withdrew a battered copy of a children's science encyclopedia. Sarah's expression softened slightly at the sight of the familiar book. "I remember this," she said quietly. "You used to read it with us every night before bed." Thomas watched the interaction carefully, ready to intervene if the emotions became too overwhelming for anyone. But there was a gentleness to this moment, a tentative bridge being built over the wounds of the past. Elizabeth moved to sit on one of the moving boxes, keeping a respectful distance. "I've been thinking a lot about those days, about all the choices I made that led us here." She looked at James, who was watching her with curious eyes. "I convinced myself that leaving was the only way to protect you all from Richard's world. But in the end, I only put you in more danger by staying silent." "Why didn't you tell anyone about Margaret's letters?" Sarah asked, her analytical mind still seeking understanding. "You could have exposed Sterling years ago." "Fear," Elizabeth answered simply. "Fear and shame. By the time I found the letter, I was already in too deep. Richard had a way of making you feel like you had no choice, like his way was the only way." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But watching you girls at the garden party, seeing your courage, it showed me what real strength looks like." Emma had begun unpacking the box, creating small piles of memories on the floor. "Look, Sarah, your science fair ribbon from 3rd grade and my art competition certificate." The simple artifacts of their shared past seemed to break down some of the walls between them. Even Sarah moved closer, picking up a family photo from happier times. "I know I can't undo what I did," Elizabeth continued. "I can't erase the pain I caused, but I'm hoping that maybe we can build something new, something honest this time." Thomas shifted James to his other hip, considering her words. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "Trust takes time to rebuild." "I know," Elizabeth nodded. "And I'm prepared to take whatever time you all need. The prosecutor says the case against Sterling could take months, even years. I'll be around if you want me to be." A small smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. "Well, we could use help with the garden. Mum always did have a green thumb." The tension in the room eased slightly as Emma began showing Elizabeth her plans for the art studio, while Sarah retrieved her laptop to share her latest findings in the Sterling case. Thomas watched his family, broken and healing, wounded, but not defeated, beginning to find their way forward. James squirmed in his arms, reaching toward the window where the afternoon sun was painting patterns on the floor. Outside, the world was still full of challenges. Sterling's lawyers were fighting back hard. The environmental cleanup was just beginning, and their community faced a long road to recovery. But in this moment, in this new house filled with light and possibilities, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Real, sustainable hope, built not on dreams of sudden wealth or easy solutions, but on the strength of truth, the power of family, and the courage to begin again. The courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade imposing in the early morning light. Thomas straightened his borrowed tie, a gift from Officer Martinez's husband, while the twins adjusted their modest but neat dresses. Today marked the beginning of the preliminary hearings in the case against Richard Sterling. Remember, Detective, Chen briefed them one final time in the courthouse parking lot. Sterling's lawyers will try to discredit your testimony. They'll bring up your financial situation, your history, anything they can use. Just stick to the truth. Sarah nodded firmly, her notebook clutched to her chest. Inside were her meticulously organized notes about the property purchases and toxics dump sites. Emma stood close to her sister, her own contribution, detailed sketches of the landfill operations and contamination patterns safely stored in a portfolio. "Where's James today?" Chen asked, noticing the baby's absence. "Elizabeth is watching him," Thomas replied, still finding it strange to trust his ex-wife with childcare, but over the past weeks, she had proven herself dedicated to making amends, starting with being there for her family during the legal proceedings. Inside the courthouse, they found the atmosphere tense with anticipation. News of the environmental scandal had spread, drawing attention from major media outlets. Several other families from their old neighborhood were present, all potential witnesses to the impact of Sterling's illegal dumping. Richard Sterling sat at the defense table still, managing to look commanding in his expensive suit. His team of lawyers surrounded him like a protective wall, papers spread before them like battle plans. But when Sterling caught sight of the Wilson family entering, Thomas noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. The proceedings began with opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp-witted woman named Janet Rivera, laid out the case methodically. She spoke of years of environmental violations, of communities poisoned for profit, of cover-ups and threats. But most damning were the documents, Margaret's letters, Elizabeth's testimony, and the evidence Thomas and his daughters had helped uncover. Sterling's lead attorney tried to paint it all as a misunderstanding, suggesting that any environmental issues were the result of previous property owners or negligent employees. But his confident demeanor faltered when Rivera produced the original purchase records Sarah had discovered, showing Sterling's direct involvement in every transaction. During a brief recess, Thomas found his daughters in the courthouse hallway, huddled together on a wooden bench. Emma was sketching her way of managing stress, while Sarah reviewed her notes for the 100th time. "You both holding up okay?" he asked, sitting between them. "I saw Mom in the witness waiting room," Emma said quietly. She looked nervous, but determined. Sarah added, "Sterling's lawyers kept staring at us during the opening. Statements, like they were trying to intimidate us." Thomas put an arm around each of his daughters. "That's because they know how strong you both are. They know that together, we have the truth on our side." The bailiff called them back into the courtroom. As they stood to return, Thomas noticed a group of their former neighbors watching them with gratitude and support. The Wilsons weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for an entire community. The afternoon brought the first witness testimonies. Environmental experts presented their findings, their scientific language occasionally simplified by Rivera's skilled questioning. Maps and charts showed the spread of contamination, each new piece of evidence building a damning picture of corporate greed and callous disregard for human life. Thomas was called to testify about his experiences at the recycling center. He spoke clearly and honestly about the strange chemical smells, the unexplained illness among workers, the suspicious late-night deliveries he'd witnessed. Sterling's lawyers tried to suggest he was bitter about his economic situation, seeking revenge against a successful businessman. "Mr. Wilson," the defense attorney asked smugly, "isn't it true that you were struggling financially? That you might have been willing to overlook certain regulations for extra payment?" "Yes, I was struggling," Thomas admitted calmly. "But I taught my daughters that integrity matters more than money. That's why I'm here today, not for revenge, but for justice." The testimony continued until late afternoon. Through it all, the twins remained focused and composed, even when Sterling's legal team tried to suggest they were too young to be reliable witnesses. Sarah's organized presentation of evidence and Emma's clear artistic documentation of the contamination patterns proved invaluable. As they left the courthouse that evening, exhausted but unbowed, they found Elizabeth waiting by their car. James was asleep in his carrier, peaceful despite the day's tensions. "You did well in there," she told them softly. "All of you." Looking at his family, his daughters standing tall despite their fatigue, his ex-wife choosing truth over comfort, and baby James representing hope for the future, Thomas felt a surge of pride. They had faced one of the hardest days of their lives together, and they had emerged stronger. The preliminary hearings would continue for several more days, but they had made their stand. Sterling's empire of secrets was beginning to crumble, one truth at a time. As they drove home to their new house, Thomas knew that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them as they had faced today, united, honest, and unwavering in their pursuit of justice. While the legal proceedings continued downtown, life in the Wilsons' new home settled into an unexpected rhythm. The backyard garden Emma had dreamed of was becoming a reality, with neat rows of vegetable seedlings pushing through the rich soil. Sarah had transformed the study into a command center for organizing case documents, her walls covered with timeline charts and connection maps. "The tomato plants are getting bigger," Emma announced one morning, returning from her daily garden. "Check." She had dirt on her knees and hope in her eyes, and the herbs Mom suggested are starting to sprout. Elizabeth's involvement in their lives had grown organically, much like the garden she helped plan. She visited between court sessions, sharing her knowledge of plants and gradually rebuilding trust through small, consistent actions. The environmental team sent their latest report, Sarah called from the study. "The cleanup at the old recycling center is making progress. They're using some new technology to remove the contamination without disturbing the surrounding soil." Thomas looked up from where he was feeding James his breakfast. The baby had grown noticeably in the weeks since. They'd moved, thriving in the stability of their new home. "That's good news for the neighborhood. How long until people can safely return?" "The initial estimate is 18 months, Sarah replied, consulting her notes. "But they're being thorough, testing everything multiple times to be sure." The doorbell rang, and Emma rushed to answer it. Officer Martinez stood on the porch holding a thick envelope. "Good morning, everyone," she smiled, entering at their invitation. "I have some updates from the prosecutor's office, and something else you should see." The family gathered around the kitchen table, their usual meeting spot for important discussions. Martinez spread out several documents, including photographs of the cleanup operation at their old neighborhood. "The restoration project is gaining attention," she explained. "Environmental groups are offering support, and several companies have volunteered resources for the cleanup effort. But this," she pulled out a newspaper article, "might interest you the most." The headline read, "Sterling Industries Board votes to remove CEO amid environmental scandal." Below was a photo of Richard Sterling leaving the company's headquarters, no longer looking quite so powerful. "The board reviewed the evidence presented in the preliminary hearings," Martinez continued. "They've decided to cooperate fully with investigators rather than risk further damage to the company's reputation." Emma's eyes widened. "Does this mean it's over?" "Not entirely," Martinez cautioned. "The criminal cases against Sterling and his top executives will continue. But this development means more resources for community restoration and better support for affected families." Sarah was already making notes, her mind working through implications. "What about the charitable foundation they announced at the garden party? The one that was supposed to help underprivileged children?" "That's actually the most interesting part," Martinez smiled. "The board wants to reorganize it as a genuine environmental justice foundation with oversight from community members. They're particularly interested in having young people involved in the planning process." She looked meaningfully at the twins. "Your work documenting the environmental impact has impressed a lot of people. The Foundation's advisory board would benefit from voices like yours." Thomas watched his daughters absorb this news. From the beginning, they had approached this crisis not just as victims, but as active participants in seeking justice. Now they were being offered a chance to help prevent similar situations in the future. "There's something else," Martinez added, pulling out one final document. "Elizabeth's testimony and cooperation have been instrumental in this case. The prosecutor has recommended a deal that would grant her immunity in exchange for her continued assistance in prosecuting Sterling and his executives." The tension that had appeared at the mention of their mother's name was different now, less sharp, more complex. Elizabeth had been working hard to prove her commitment to doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. "She's changed," Emma said softly, looking out at the garden their mother had helped design. "Really changed, I mean, not just pretending like before." Sarah nodded slowly. "She's trying to fix things, not just with Sterling, but with us too." Thomas thought about the long journey that had brought them here. From the day he found James, in that cardboard box, to now, their lives had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The challenges weren't over, but they were facing them together, growing stronger with each step forward. "Dad," Emma called from the window, excitement in her voice. "Come look, the first flower is blooming in the garden." They all moved too. See the small purple blossom, pushing up through soil that had been carefully prepared and tended. Like their family, it had taken time, patience, and care to create the right conditions for growth. James babbled happily in Thomas's arms, reaching toward the colorful flower. The morning sun painted everything in shades of possibility, highlighting the new life emerging from what had once been empty ground. "You know what this means," Sarah said, a rare smile spreading across her face. "It's time to start planning the next phase of the garden, maybe something bigger, with space for everyone to contribute." The simple suggestion carried deeper meaning. They were all ready to grow, to build something new together. The healing process, like their garden, was just beginning to show its first promising signs of life. 3 months had passed since the preliminary hearings, and autumn was painting the world in warm colors. The Wilsons' garden had flourished, beyond their expectations, becoming a symbol of their family's renewal. Today it was hosting its first community gathering, a meeting of the newly formed Environmental Justice Youth Council. Sarah stood before a group of teenagers from their old neighborhood, presenting her research on sustainable urban development. Her confidence had grown alongside her expertise, and she now spoke with the authority of someone who knew her work could make a real difference. "The key is community involvement," she explained, pointing to her latest charts. "When people understand what's happening in their environment, they're more likely to protect it and speak up when something's wrong." Emma moved through the crowd, documenting the meeting through her artwork. Her sketches had evolved into a powerful tool for environmental advocacy, helping people visualize both problems and solutions. Several of her pieces were already being used in educational materials about toxic waste awareness. Thomas watched from the back porch, where he sat with James on his lap. The baby was growing fast, his curious eyes taking in everything around him. Elizabeth stood nearby, having earned her place at family gatherings through months of consistent effort and genuine change. "The foundation board approved all of Sarah's proposals," she said quietly. "They're implementing her monitoring system across all their properties." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The foundation that Sterling had intended as a cover-up was now becoming a real force for positive change, largely guided by the very people he had tried to silence. Detective Chen arrived as the meeting was wrapping up, carrying news about the ongoing legal proceedings. The teenagers gathered around, many of them having provided testimony about how the contamination had affected their families. "Sterling's lawyers are pushing for a plea deal," Chen announced. "They know the evidence is overwhelming. He's willing to admit to all environmental violations and corporate fraud charges." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sterling's admission of guilt would validate everything they had fought to prove, but some hoped for a fuller accounting of his crimes. "What about Margaret?" Emma asked, voicing what many were thinking. "Will he confess to what happened to her?" Chen shook her head. "Those charges would be harder to prove in court. The prosecutor thinks the environmental and fraud convictions will be enough to ensure he faces significant consequences." Sarah's analytical mind was already working through the implications. With a guilty plea, would there be more resources available for community restoration? "Yes," Chen confirmed. "Part of the proposed deal includes substantial financial restitution. The funds would be managed by the Reformed Foundation with strict oversight." The meeting dispersed as sunset approached, leaving the family to digest the news. Emma returned to her garden, checking on the autumn vegetables they had planted. Sarah retreated to her study, already planning how to utilize the potential new resources. "It feels strange," Elizabeth said, helping Emma with the plants. "When I first married Richard, I thought I was stepping into a perfect life. Now I realize I was happier here in this garden than I ever was in that mansion." Thomas watched his ex-wife and daughter working together, their movements in harmony. As they tended the growing things, the bitterness he had carried for so long had gradually been replaced by understanding. People could change, just as seasons could turn and gardens could bloom. James squirmed in his lap, reaching toward a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. The baby's presence had been the catalyst for so much change, yet he remained, blissfully unaware of his role in their family's transformation. Sarah emerged from her study with fresh paperwork. "The foundation wants us to help design a new community center," she announced. "They're thinking of building it where the old recycling center was, once the cleanup is complete." "A place for education and environmental monitoring," Emma added, excitedly. "Maybe with a community garden, art spaces, and science labs." The ideas flowed freely as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over their flourishing garden. They were no longer just surviving. They were building something meaningful, not only for themselves, but for their entire community. "No," Thomas said, looking at his family. "When I found James that day, I thought our lives couldn't get any more complicated. I never imagined that complication would lead to something so positive." Elizabeth gently touched the baby's cheek. "Sometimes the hardest changes bring the most beautiful results, like flowers pushing through concrete." The autumn breeze carried the scent of ripening vegetables and late-blooming flowers, a reminder that growth was constant, healing was possible, and the future held more possibilities than any of them had imagined just a few months ago. As darkness fell, they moved inside, leaving their garden to the evening stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would face them together, their roots now firmly planted in soil they had worked hard to restore. The day of Sterling's plea hearing dawned clear and cool. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and environmental activists, all waiting to witness the fall of one of the city's most powerful figures. The Wilson family arrived early, having learned from experience to avoid the media circus. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Richard Sterling sat at the defense table, diminished but still maintaining a facade of dignity. His expensive suit couldn't hide the toll the past months had taken on him. When Elizabeth entered with the twins, he deliberately looked away. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Henderson entered the courtroom. The proceedings began with the prosecutor outlining the terms of the plea agreement. Sterling would plead guilty to multiple counts of environmental violations, corporate fraud, and document falsification. In exchange, he would provide detailed information about other corporate environmental crimes. Before accepting this plea, Judge Henderson addressed the court, "I want to hear from community representatives about the impact of these crimes." Sarah stood first, her presentation organized and compelling. She spoke about the health effects on local children, the long-term environmental damage, and the betrayal of community trust. Her voice never wavered as she described how Sterling's actions had affected real people, not just statistics on a page. Emma followed, using her artistic documentation to show the human side of the story. Her sketches of children playing near contaminated areas, of families worried about their health, brought the impact home in a way that technical reports couldn't match. Other community members spoke as well, each adding their voice to the narrative. Gay of harm and healing. Through it all, Sterling sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Finally, Elizabeth stepped forward. She had been granted immunity for her testimony, but chose to make a final statement. "Your Honor, I was part of the system that allowed these crimes to happen. My silence made me complicit. But I've learned that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, to choose right over easy." Thomas held James during the proceedings, the baby now old enough to sit quietly in his lap. He watched his ex-wife's testimony with mixed emotions, remembering how far they had all come from that day at the landfill. Judge Henderson listened to all the statements before addressing Sterling directly. "Mr. Sterling, Your actions show a profound disregard for human life and environmental safety. While this plea agreement spares the community the trauma of a lengthy trial, it does not diminish the severity of your crimes. The sentence was handed down: significant prison time, massive fines, and a lifetime ban from serving as a corporate officer. Sterling's face remained impassive, but his shoulders slumped slightly as the reality of his future settled in. After the hearing, the family gathered in the courthouse garden, away from the media frenzy. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended flower beds. "It feels strange," Emma said, sketching the scene in her notebook, "like the end of a chapter, but not the end of the story." Sarah nodded, already making notes about next steps. The foundation board meets tomorrow to discuss implementing the restitution funds. They want to start with healthcare screening for affected families. Elizabeth watched her daughters with quiet pride. "You've both grown so much through all of this. You've shown more courage and wisdom than most adults I know." Thomas bounced James gently, the baby reaching for falling leaves. "We all have. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what we're capable of." Officer Martinez joined them, carrying final paperwork. "The adoption proceedings can move forward now," she announced. "With Sterling's conviction and Elizabeth's cooperation, there shouldn't be any legal obstacles." The news brought smiles to everyone's faces. James would officially become a Wilson, though in their hearts he already was. "I have something for all of you," Elizabeth said, pulling out a small photo album. "I found these while cleaning out my old things at Richard's house. They're from when we were first a family." The twins moved closer as she opened the album. There were pictures of birthday parties, school events, quiet family moments that had been lost in the chaos of recent years. "We can't go back," Elizabeth said softly, "but maybe we can build something new, something better, using the lessons we've learned." Thomas looked at his expanded family, his strong, capable daughters, his growing son, his ex-wife finding her way back to her true self. They had faced corporate giants, environmental disasters, and personal betrayals. Through it all, they had discovered that family bonds, like the roots of Emma's garden plants, could grow stronger when tested by adversity. The media would soon tell the story of Sterling's downfall, of corporate greed exposed and justice served. But the real story, Thomas knew, was here in this courthouse garden. A family rebuilding trust, a community healing its wounds, and the promise of a better future growing from the seeds of truth they had planted together. 1 year had passed since Sterling's conviction. The Wilsons' garden had grown into something remarkable, with raised beds full of vegetables, flowering plants attracting butterflies, and a small greenhouse where Emma conducted her experiments in urban farming. The space had become more than just a garden. It was a living classroom where community members gathered to learn about environmental stewardship. Today was special, the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Community Environmental Education Center. The site of the old recycling center had been fully decontaminated, and the foundation was putting Sterling's restitution money to good use. Sarah stood at the podium, now 15 and carrying herself with the confidence of someone twice her age. "This center represents more than just a building," she addressed the gathered crowd. "It's a promise to future generations that we won't repeat the mistakes of the past." The architectural plans, displayed on easels around the construction site, showed Emma's influence clearly. Her artistic vision had helped design spaces that would be both beautiful and functional. Science labs, art studios, community meeting rooms, and a rooftop garden that would serve as both educational space and food source for local families. Thomas watched from the audience, James perched on his shoulders to see better. The toddler was growing fast, his personality emerging more each day. He had Thomas's quiet determination and, surprisingly, Elizabeth's green thumb. He already loved helping Emma in the garden. Elizabeth sat nearby, no longer the polished society wife she had once been. She wore practical clothes suited for the gardening workshops she now led, teaching community members how to grow their own food safely. Her relationship with the twins had evolved into something new. Not quite the mother-daughter bond of their early years, but a respectful partnership built on shared goals and genuine care. The center will include a state-of-the-art environmental monitoring system. Sarah continued her presentation. Local students will be trained to track soil and water quality, ensuring our community never again falls victim to corporate negligence. Emma stepped up next, unveiling her latest project, a series of murals that would adorn the center's walls, telling the story of their community's journey from environmental crisis to empowerment. The images showed not just the challenges they had faced, but the strength they had found in working together. Detective Chen, now a close family friend, stood at the back of the crowd. The case that had brought her into their lives had led to broader investigations of corporate environmental crimes across the state. She had become an advocate for community-based environmental justice, often citing the Wilson family's story as an example of how ordinary people could create extraordinary change. After the ceremony, as people mingled and examined the plans more closely, Thomas found himself standing with his daughters at the edge of the construction site. "Remember when we first moved to the new house?" Emma asked, sketching the scene before her. "We could barely imagine having a small garden, and now look at all this." Sarah nodded, checking something on her tablet. "The Foundation's environmental education program is already being copied in other cities. They want us to help train community leaders across the state." Thomas felt a surge of pride. His daughters had transformed their painful experiences into something powerful and positive. They hadn't just survived their challenges, they had used them to create lasting change. Elizabeth joined them, carrying James, who had been helping her demonstrate composting techniques to interested community members. "The Organic Farming Collective wants to partner with the center," she announced. "They think we could supply fresh produce to local schools." The mention of schools brought smiles to everyone's faces. The Twins High School had recently recognized their work, creating a special environmental leadership program inspired by their efforts. Several of their classmates had already joined the initiative, eager to make their own contributions to community improvement. "You know what this reminds me of?" Thomas said, looking around at the busy construction site. "That day at the landfill when I found James, I thought I was just saving one child, but really, we were starting something much bigger." Emma reached for her brother, who went to her happily. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. "Speaking of changes," Sarah added, "the Foundation Board approved our proposal for the scholarship program. Starting next year, we'll be able to help other kids from affected communities pursue environmental science degrees." The sound of construction equipment starting up drew their attention back to the site. The ground that had once been contaminated with industrial waste was being prepared for a new purpose, one that would serve the community for generations to come. As they watched the first shovel break ground, Thomas reflected on how far they had come. From a struggling single father to a community leader, from abandoned children to powerful advocates for change, from a broken family to something new and stronger, their journey had been remarkable. James pointed excitedly at the construction vehicles, babbling in his toddler language. His innocence and enthusiasm reminded them all why their work mattered, for him and for all the children who would inherit the world they were helping to create. Spring arrived with a burst of color in the Wilsons' garden. The fruit trees they had planted 2 years ago were blooming for the first time, promising a future harvest. Emma stood among them, carefully documenting their progress for the center's agricultural program, while Sarah conducted soil tests with a group of student volunteers. Inside the house, Thomas prepared for a significant event, James's official adoption ceremony. Though the legal process had been completed months ago, they had waited for the completion of the new Community Environmental Education Center to hold the celebration. It seemed fitting to combine the two milestones that had changed their lives so profoundly. "Dad," Emma called from the garden, "the cherry blossoms are perfect. We should take the family photo here." The family photo had become a tradition, marking their journey together. Each year's picture showed their growth, not just physical changes, but the subtle transformations in how they carried themselves, how they related to each other, how they faced the world. Elizabeth arrived early to help with preparations, bringing a handmade quilt for James. She had pieced it together from meaningful fabrics, a square from Emma's first art smock, another from Sarah's favorite childhood science shirt. and even a piece from Thomas's old work uniform. For James to know his whole story, she explained, running her hand over the careful stitching. The hard parts and the beautiful parts, all sewn together. The twins examined the quilt with interest, recognizing pieces of their shared history. Their relationship with their mother had found its own unique balance, not trying to recapture what was lost, but building something new and honest instead. As they prepared for the ceremony, Sarah shared exciting news. The environmental monitoring program is showing amazing results. The cleanup methods we developed here are being implemented in similar cases across the country. And the art therapy program at the center is expanding, Emma added. We're getting requests from other communities wanting to learn how to use art for environmental advocacy. Thomas adjusted James's bow tie, reflecting on how their personal crisis had grown into a movement for positive change. The little boy who had arrived in a cardboard box was now the heart of a family that had learned to turn adversity into opportunity. The ceremony itself was held in the center's main hall, under Emma's striking murals. Community members filled the space, families they had helped, students they had taught, officials they had worked with to create change. Detective Chen sat in the front row, beside Officer Martinez and her husband. Judge Henderson, who had presided over Sterling's case, now stood before them with a different purpose. Her warm smile set everyone at ease as she began the adoption proceedings. Family, she said, comes in many forms. Sometimes it's born, sometimes it's chosen, and sometimes, like this remarkable group before me, it's forged through challenges that reveal our true strength. As they exchanged vows of commitment, Thomas holding James while the twins and Elizabeth stood close, the judge's words rang true. They had become something unique and powerful together, their bonds strengthened by the very things that might have broken them. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the center's rooftop garden. The space that had once been an industrial wasteland now bloomed with life. Children played among the raised beds, adults chatted by the hydroponic displays, and students demonstrated their latest environmental projects. "Look at this," Sarah said, showing her family the center's latest data. "The groundwater readings are completely clear now. The restoration methods actually worked better than we expected." Emma had set up an exhibition of her environmental art, including a timeline of their journey from crisis to transformation. The final piece showed their family in the garden, surrounded by growing things, with the community center rising in the background. Elizabeth studied the painting thoughtfully. "When I left," she said quietly, "I thought I was reaching for something better. I never imagined the truly better thing would grow from what I left behind." "That's the thing about gardens, Emma," replied, her expression wise beyond her years. "Sometimes the strongest plants grow from composted mistakes." James tugged at Thomas's hand, pointing to the butterfly garden, where dozens of monarchs danced among the flowers. His face showed the same wonder that Thomas had seen that first day at the landfill, the pure, innocent joy that had reminded them all what they were fighting for. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the rooftop garden, Thomas gathered his family for one more photo. They stood together among the blooming plants, their faces reflecting not just happiness, but something deeper, the quiet confidence of people who had discovered their own strength and purpose. The camera captured the moment. James in Thomas's arms, the twins on either side, Elizabeth completing the circle. Behind them, the city stretched out toward the horizon, its future a little brighter because of the changes they had helped create. They had started as a broken family trying to survive. They had become something